Chapter 27, Dictatorships and the Second World War.
Part 5, and more, the Second World War.
Now we'll travel to the Pacific. Due to the fact that this is AP European history, we haven't really talked about the Pacific theater of the war. But World War II truly is two separate wars that were taking place at roughly the same time. In fact, some historians date the true start of World War II to the 1931 invasion of Manchuria by the Japanese army. Prior to that, though, a ultranationalistic, militaristic government had seized control of Japan. The emperor was not truly in charge of this government, but he served as the figurehead that unified this, you could almost call it a fascist government, which was in charge of Japan. Now, they formed a formal alliance with Italy and Germany in 1940.
Watch out for snakes!
In that same year, Japan announced the formation of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. The original intention was the idea that Japan would liberate the Pacific from European influences.
The goal of this Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere was a sham, though. It was a Japanese military-occupied territory where they exploited them like an imperial power of the previous century. Japan's expansion into the Pacific came into direct conflict with U.S. imperial ambitions there. The United States is holding on to territories such as Hawaii and the Philippines.
But when I do it, it's cute!
The United States is going to cut off oil supplies to Japan, and Japan, in response, is going to launch the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. They're going to attack the military base at that territory and declare war immediately after. And so the date, which will live in infamy, December 7th, 1941,
leads to
war were declared.
This brought the United States into a grand alliance with Great Britain and the Soviet Union. Winston Churchill was the one to term this a grand alliance, and it truly was that because of the combined might of these powers. The United States had massive industrial capability, which fueled the war effort. Great Britain's navy and its geographical location made it an impregnable fortress, and the Soviet Union provided a massive amount of manpower and military might to break the Nazi advance.
Nazis. I hate these guys.
The Grand Alliance was able to agree on a Europe-first strategy. That meant that the combined forces would be focused on defeating Hitler before turning their attention to Japan. Much to Stalin's chagrin, this Europe-first strategy did not mean that the United States and Great Britain planned to attack in France. Instead, they landed a force in North Africa. In May 1942, British forces halted Axis penetration of North Africa by decisively defeating a combined Nazi and Italian armed force at the Battle of Al Alamein. Winston Churchill termed this the hinge of fate that cemented the Allied victory. The Nazi general Rommel was able to lead a few successful battles, but eventually his Africa Corps was crushed. Great Britain and the United States then used this new launching pad of North Africa to attack into Sicily. The successful invasion of Sicily led to a toppling of Mussolini's government. He would actually get arrested trying to flee to Nazi Germany, and he would be executed by his own people. Unfortunately for the Italians, this did not mean that the war was over for them.
Watch out for snakes!
Instead, the Nazis invaded Italy and met Great Britain and American forces on the peninsula. This fighting would last for most of World War II. The real turning point of the European theater, though, occurred on the Eastern Front. Hitler had been forced to abandon the tactic of due to the Russian winter. Nazi forces now shifted south to attack the industrial city of Stalingrad. The battle began in November of 1942, but would only end in February of 1943 after much suffering on both sides. But the huge catastrophic defeat suffered by the Nazis turned public opinion against the war in Germany for the first time. But not just public opinion in Germany, but within the military itself. There were several unsuccessful attempts to assassinate Adolf Hitler before the end of World War II happened.
Just slow it down. I'll shoot Hitler out the window. Darn! I hit Eleanor Roosevelt by mistake.
With fighting stalled in the peninsula of Italy, the Allies were looking to open a second front on the continent of Europe. To try to confuse the Germans, many targets were floated through intelligence, but one was the true target of history's greatest naval invasion. On June 6, 1944, the Allies landed on Normandy Beach. Future President Dwight D. Eisenhower was in charge of the combined forces. Fighting was intense, but the Allies were able to establish a beachhead from which they were then be able to bring supplies, troops, and airplanes to further strike into Germany. At this point, it really was just a matter before Germany was going to eventually lose. Meanwhile, in the Pacific theater, America had been able to turn the tide of the war. The Allies were clearly on their way to victory, even though months of intense fighting lay ahead of the combatants on each side. The Allies were pushing in now on the European front from both sides. The Allied forces were about to enter Germany when Hitler made one last desperate attempt. He ordered his tanks to strike at the enemy lines to try to cut through them and reach the port city of Antwerp. Their tanks were able to initially move through the Allied defensive lines, catching the Americans by surprise. This led to the Battle of the Bulge, so named because of the fact that the defensive line formed a slight bulge. But the Allies were able to quickly regroup, and from that point on, the race now was on between the Allies and to who could reach Berlin quickest. Soviet forces ended up being the ones to enter Berlin, much to Hitler's disappointment. Hitler committed suicide in his bunker on April 30th, 1945. Now, there are some who question whether that actually happened. Some think he pulled this off.
Eine Minuten! Ach, das Wagenphone ist eine Nuisance-Phone. Buenas noches, mein Führer. Ja.
Either way, Hitler was out of power and would never return to power again after 1945. Japanese troops would continue to fight, though, with enormous courage and dedication in spite of repeated U.S. victories throughout the summer of 1945. The president at the time, Harry Truman, who had taken over after Roosevelt had passed away, made the decision to use the atomic bomb on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The mass bombing of cities and civilians was one of the new terrible practices that had been taking place during World War II. And on August 6th and 9th of 1945, the war ended in a final nightmare of the atomic blast on these cities. The world would look dramatically different after World War II. The country of Germany would be divided up between the victors and would set the stage for the conflict that would come next, the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States.
See? I told you so.